In our previous lectures, we've considered the different forms that communist regimes in China and in Cambodia could assume, though still claiming loyalty to the same ideology. In our lecture today, we'll examine how, in the age of the Cold War, many different routes to socialism could exist, and in particular, we'll focus on the regimes of East Germany, the Soviet Union, and North Korea. The varieties of socialist experience, however, would be even wider than those of the communist East. Socialism and communism could take markedly different forms in different countries. In Western Europe, a vibrant social democratic movement espousing social democracy steadily moved towards more moderate forms. Social democrats increasingly stressed reform over revolution. This would have been a heresy to Lenin and to other communists. They sought a broader appeal across classes for the notion of the amelioration of social problems. Emblematic of this development was the fortunes of the largest and earlier, one of the best known and most highly reputed social democratic movements, that of Germany's Social Democratic Party. In its Bad Godesberg program in 1958, the SPD revised its Marxist doctrines to instead avow both economic planning and economic freedom as cardinal parts of its program. By contrast, however, in today's lecture, we'll move our focus to the case of three hardline states, which showed not this reform, but rather a movement towards radical models of transformation. These will be East Germany, the Soviet Union, and North Korea. And I hope what will emerge from today's lecture is a sense of both the diversity and the commonalities among these hardline regimes. In the case of East Germany, the German Democratic Republic was declared to be the state of the workers and peasants. After the wall had been erected in 1961, closing off the possibility of voting with one's feet, a grim stabilization began to set in East Germany. Many citizens saw that they must now come to terms with the inevitable and find their peace with the regime which ruled over them. But there was another element that certainly gave a sense of optimism to East Germany in its earliest years. A certain sense of pride that Marxism, its official ideology, had certainly been a product growing out of German culture and German experience. Indeed, in what might otherwise be considered almost a nationalist statement, it was commonly said or joked that if anyone in the world could make communism work, it would be the Germans. The Germans were said to have the requisite virtues of hard work, discipline, industry. The German Democratic Republic was to become a worldwide showcase showing how this model of government and social organization would move towards success. But at the same time, there were internal contradictions. In spite of the claims that were being made by the regime to an equality among its citizens, in fact, one could see the emergence of certain groups with privileges. The party elites enjoyed what they themselves would not have called class privilege, but whose special favors could certainly appear in that way to the population. This included access to special cars, special quarters and districts where the party elites would live, special stores that were not open to ordinary citizens of the Republic, greater access for their children to education, to movement up in their careers, as well as to those highly prized international exchanges. One member of the party elite who rose steadily through the ranks and who would be the leader of the East German state from 1971 right until the eve of its collapse was Erich Honecker, who had risen through the party's ranks and was quite clearly a product of the system that he ruled over. In ways reminiscent of other dictatorial regimes we've discussed, the East German state concentrated on making sure that its message was passed along to the youth. The Free German Youth Organization, the FDJ, regimented youth, sent them marching, singing patriotic songs, hailing the advance of socialism. To the critics of this organization, it in many ways bore haunting resemblances to the Hitler Youth. The churches in East Germany were harassed, infiltrated, or closed. And increasingly, religious ritual, traditional ritual, were replaced with secular, newly created, newly invented traditions like youth confirmation, replacing earlier confirmation in the Christian rite with a pledge of one's loyalty to socialist ideals. The flip side of such attempts to indoctrinate and win loyalty through propaganda was an atmosphere of coercion and control by the secret police of the East German state, known as the Stasi. Stasi was a bureaucratic acronym that stood for the Staatssicherheitsdienst, or the State Security Service. The coercive forces of the police also manned the borders. Border troops guarded the wall in Berlin itself, as well as stretching down across the German border, and these troops had orders to shoot to kill. Flight from the Republic was an official crime, and in this case, one could pay for that crime with one's life. Dissidents and others who protested against the regime within were kept under constant surveillance and were spied upon by a remarkably extensive web of stool pigeons and informers in their midst. Taken all together, the state security police, the Stasi, established a remarkably intricate repressive apparatus for spying on East Germans. There were not only the regular secret police, but also those informers who were called unofficial collaborators, who were rewarded and encouraged to denounce and spy upon co-workers and families. When this was later revealed after the collapse of the East German regime, its results obviously could be shattering on those who had been thus betrayed by family members and friends. And the numbers of those who were tied in to this web of complicity was enormous. An estimated 250,000 people worked for the Stasi from 1950 to 1989. This, when one breaks down the figures, included one secret policeman for every 166 citizens. When informers were added, this would be one security person for every 6.5 persons. And I point out in my classes on German history that the implication for a classroom of students such as the one listening to a lecture would be that almost certainly in their number would be a significant number of informers. The Stasi generated enormous amounts of paperwork in the process of spying on its own citizens. It's been estimated that this included 121 miles of files on targets, and the Stasi also maintained feared prisons like Hohenschönhausen. Their activities included the bugging of apartments, collaboration with international terrorist groups, trafficking in people, in fact, as older individuals could be bought free by relatives in West Germany and allowed to emigrate, as was also sometimes the case for some dissidents. And the Stasi was especially proud of its active fraternal collaboration with the Soviet KGB. The Stasi thought of themselves as being in that lineage. They were proud of being descendants of Lenin's Cheka, the secret police that had been established right at the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution. The East German state would also seek to win for itself a sense of legitimacy, a sense of the agreement of its population in the legitimacy of its own rule. At the same time, there were difficulties. The inequalities in terms of how people were treated, the party elites versus ordinary citizens, were all too patent. The failures in providing a higher standard of living were also quite clear. At the same time, rhetorically, these shortcomings would be justified in an elegant term of phrase as really existing socialism. It was claimed that the East German state had achieved the closest advance to socialism that had yet been achieved, and thus the promised land was but a hand's breadth away. Legitimacy was also sought in other ways. It was sought in part through showing quite literally that the new man and the new woman had been built in this revolutionary regime in the sports programs of the East German state. Vast resources were spent on the Olympic program and on Leipzig Sport University. Vast sums were pumped into the sports programs, and as is now clear, vast amounts of drugs were pumped into the veins of athletes competing for the honor of the East German states in the Olympics as well. A reality that in many cases was hidden from the athletes themselves. This doping, this drugging of athletes in order to achieve superhuman performance was common and often led to tragic results. One reads now in the press of cases of women athletes who had been given so many drugs that they in fact turned physically into men. Their health has been damaged, perhaps destroyed, all in the interests of a state that was willing to sacrifice them on the altars of Olympic success. I recall how at the Olympic competitions one would see nearly superhuman figures of great muscular bulk, men as well as women, standing in the competition for the East German state. In the 5-year plan of 1986, the East German state further announced that it was surging ahead in technology. This was to be German genius and efficiency deployed to show what socialism could achieve in a German context. This 5-year plan promised investments in the very cutting-edge technology, cybernetics, robots, and computer engineering. But the results, in fact, were intensely disappointing. The rhetoric of viewing the future and moving towards it was there, but in fact the resources were already lagging. The East German state was not delivering on its promises. Nonetheless, we might pause for a moment to consider some of the visions of the future that were offered to the people of this state. They included the promise that soon the standards of living in the West would be outstripped, would be overtaken, but clearly these results were lagging. In a bizarre utopian vision that was not shared with the population at large, government planners envisioned making the wall between the Germanys, their anti-fascist protection wall, as it was termed, a perfect border, a perfect barrier. In retrospect, this seems a very odd thing to have devoted so many resources towards, and a particularly ignoble utopian vision. The hope was that by the year 2000, a year that the East German state didn't live to see, but that by the year 2000, this border would have been perfectly mechanized, perfectly technologically coordinated, with automatic guns that didn't even need border guards, with surveillance devices which would make it impermeable. A perfect border. In fact, another technology was steadily undermining the East German state and its claims to holding a plausible vision of the future. That other technology was television. The location of the East German state, cheek by jowl with West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, meant that Western television, with its popular entertainment, with its news broadcasts, including also in its programming those advertisements for all sorts of consumer goods that you just had to have, were also being beamed into East German territory and being picked up on the television screens of East Germans. This was, in fact, as it turns out, a feature of the East German life that was tolerated, at least by the East German state, because it was seen as a perhaps harmless outlet for the curiosity of citizens. But nonetheless, the subversive message that life was otherwise in the rest of the world was making headway in the East German state in ways that are difficult to quantify. East Germans used to joke about those members of their own East German territory who were out of the range of West German TV. They were considered to be living in the valley of the clueless, those people who didn't have a clue about what was going on outside. We return to a theme that we've seen again and again in this course, that means of communication and technology could be a double-edged sword. They could propagate, as in the radio of the Nazi regime, a message effectively, beaming it to the masses. On the other hand, as in this case, technology could also subvert the government message. We turn next to the case of the Big Brother, the founding state of the communist project, the Soviet Union. It had a facade of vigor and disappointing realities behind. The Soviet Union managed to project remarkably an attractive image to many of power and progress after World War II. This was underlined by its technological achievements, by the launching of atomic weapons, the launching of the Sputnik satellite in 1957, which panicked Western societies with the prospect of being left behind in the space race, in which the Soviets then would go on to achieve remarkable successes. In this context, nuclear weapons were an especially important feature of the technological prowess of the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons would give it undisputed superpower status, even at a time when its economic performance was lagging. Now, even Western intelligence agencies were slow to understand the depths of the systemic crisis of the planned economies of the Soviet Union and other Eastern European states, but some observers who had already noted the lack of consumer goods, the unreliability of statistics, the outrageous claims made in propaganda about advances in economics, considered the Soviet Union to be little better than, as one put it, upper Volta with rockets, a third world country, in essence, whose claim to status was its military machine. And that military machine clearly exacted an enormous price and was an enormous drag on the economy of the Soviet Union. We might mention parenthetically that the Cold War was expensive for both sides. It was an enormous expense. In the Soviet case, it was estimated that perhaps a quarter of its gross domestic product was spent on the arms race. Historians of economics have pointed out that, in fact, it's difficult to be precise about these estimates because the entire economy of the Soviet Union was remarkably militarized. Added to these expenses were further subsidies to communist satellites and communist movements worldwide who had to be encouraged, given the ideological commitment to revolution. And yet, observers of the Soviet system noticed, especially after the impact of de-Stalinization, Khrushchev's revelation of the crimes of Stalin, crimes against the party were emphasized, a certain winding down of the ideological fervor that had earlier characterized the Soviet Union under Lenin or Stalin. This turn away from revolutionary fervor and fanaticism now raised the question of how the system could yet continue to exist given its ideological mission. Well, what's clear is that within the ranks of the party itself, there grew people who've worked their way up the system who pursued perhaps ideological conviction, but also careerist goals. A privileged elite that came to be called the apparat, meaning the machine, or the nomenklatura, meaning those whose names mattered in the nomenclature of lists of the party elite. This was a phenomenon that undermined the egalitarian claims of the classless society of the Soviet Union. And the leadership itself seemed to be stumbling. The leadership grew old, so that some historians of the Soviet regime in its later stages speak of a geriatric leadership which had not passed the torch to a younger generation, undermining the image of the vitality of the communist ideology. This was coupled with continuing repression. Khrushchev, in part having angered some of his own allies within the movement by his unsparing revelation of Stalin's crimes, was turned out of office in 1964 and was replaced by a collective leadership. From the ranks of that collective leadership, there emerged one man as main leader, Leonid Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev announced that the Soviet Union was on course and it would stay that course. It was in the stage of developed socialism. It's a theoretical phrase that was supposed to inspire confidence. It probably didn't. But it was the stage which indicated the approach of the perfection of communism. Leonid Brezhnev's own appearance, stolid, heavy, and increasingly aging, in his last years in office seemed a perfect expression of the immobility, the lack of will for reform, or a consideration of new ideas that burdened the Soviet Union towards the end of its time. The repression of dissidents continued, now without Stalin's emphasis on mass murder and the Gulag, but it could include such brutal measures as psychiatric hospitalization. The reasoning was that anyone who dissented or who was unhappy with the state of affairs must clearly ipso facto be mentally ill. In Eastern Europe and elsewhere in the world, the Brezhnev Doctrine was coined as a rationale for intervention. The Brezhnev Doctrine argued that communist advance was inevitable and was not to be rolled back. Once a socialist revolution had been achieved, the Soviet Union would intervene if necessary to stop it from going back. And thus, intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968 was justified by the Brezhnev Doctrine, as was the disastrous invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. At the same time, however, there was a mounting bill to be paid in terms of economic, technological, and environmental disaster in what appeared to be the mighty Soviet Union. Visitors to the Soviet Union, and I had a chance myself to visit in these times, would be shocked by the sights of empty stores selling perhaps enormous jugs of vinegar. I never really understood what that was for, and otherwise with bare shelves, with little in the way of consumer goods. This made economic decline clear, despite falsified official statistics. In the long term, Stalin's decimation of generations of specialists had left damaging gaps in Soviet science, which now were evident. The crackpot agricultural projects championed by people like Trofim Lysenko, including the Virgin Lands project to plow up enormous plains in Central Asia and Central Russia, produced, as Americans could probably have predicted from their own experience with the Dust Bowl, environmental disaster with the soil blowing away. By contrast, the private garden plots that had been still allowed to farmers as a small concession, perhaps temporary, were enormously productive in comparison to the state-owned farms. And this was already an indication of where things might be headed. And then came perhaps an archetypal environmental disaster. In April of 1986, just before the May Day parade celebrated by the Soviet Union, the Chernobyl reactor near Kiev exploded. The costs of this accident and its initial denial by Soviet authorities eroded state credibility. One needs to hear the voices of parents whose children were sent out to cheer and to march in the May Day parades while a cloud of atomic debris hovered overhead, to hear their fury and their disgust with their government, to sense the loss of confidence that had ensued. This loss of confidence in a ruling elite is difficult to quantify, but nonetheless was important. And jokes about the absurdity of the Soviet regime proliferated, making clear that loss of confidence. Within the party itself, a mood of crisis led to the elevation of a true believer and a reformer, Gorbachev, by 1985, whose attempt to save the system would bring about its end. A final regime that we'll consider is that of North Korea. North Korea had earlier been a Chinese satellite, was annexed by Japan in 1910. After World War II, it was to become an independent country, but in the Cold War, it was divided into two states, the South Korean under American patronage, North Korea under the Soviets. With Stalin's go-ahead, the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung invaded the South in 1950. China then intervened when the Americans counterattacked. The Forgotten War, as it's been called, ending in 1953, claimed 3 million dead. Without a peace treaty, the tense standoff has endured for half a century. North Korea remains a massively militarized and isolated hermit kingdom, spending an estimated third of its gross domestic product on one of the world's largest armies. At the same time, famine has stalked the land, killing perhaps over 2 million in the 1990s. The leaders of the North Korean state are significant. The first leader was Kim Il-sung, called the Great Leader, installed by Soviet forces. He was born as Kim Song-ju near Pyongyang, became an anti-Japanese guerrilla, was trained and educated in the Soviet Union, and then served in the Soviet army. Later, he was put in place of leader of the North Korean state and crafted the ideology of yuche, or self-reliance, preaching autarky and radical isolation. In 1994, upon his death, he was succeeded by his son, Kim Jong-il, who is called in the propaganda the son of the 21st century. This man had been born in Siberia, schooled in East Germany, and has the reputation of being a volatile and cruel, narcissistic playboy. He's said to be enormously vain. He is apparently only 5'3" in height, but has a high hairdo and platform shoes to emphasize his prominent status. Elaborate cults of leadership were built up around both leaders, including the declaration of Kim Il-sung even after his death as president for eternity, omnipresent statues, mass parades, songs with titles like "The Leader Will Always Be With Us" or "My Country Under the Sunshine of the Party," and flower shows featuring blooms dedicated to the leaders are common. Like many other dictators we've surveyed in this course, Kim Jong-il is an avid enthusiast of film. He's said to have the largest collection of Daffy Duck films in the world. He has in fact even kidnapped actors for his entertainment. His own lifestyle is enormously self-indulgent and luxurious. But the tools of state that are deployed in enforcing the ideology and the authority of the state are also significant and in many ways mimic ones we've seen before. Every household in North Korea is said to have a radio receiver called the speaker, which broadcasts marches, songs, speeches, and proclamations. Like the Soviet Punkt radio, it cannot be turned off or the stations changed. It is always on, always speaking to the masses. As a repressive apparatus of the state, a dozen prison camps resembling the Soviet Gulag in their brutality are said to hold an estimated 1 million. The state is isolated from the outside world. There's no access to the internet. The people are shielded from outside influences. And yet, there is an energetic foreign policy, often disastrously irrational in its approach, that is taken to be characteristic of this North Korean state. As was recently admitted by the North Korean government, in the past there were kidnappings of Japanese to serve as agents to spread the message of North Korean ideology. A former ally, Russia, has in fact reported that North Korea had been experimenting with chemical and biological weapons. Sporadic and often disorganized attempts at controlled economic reform have yielded only more economic crisis and tens of thousands of desperate North Korean refugees trying to flee to China. Sometimes they're turned back and face execution. And these are policies, moreover, that continue into our own day in the new century. In the new century, North Korea is one of the last surviving Stalinist states, and it recently has taken on an intensified, threatening stance towards the outside world, perhaps an expression of its interior paranoia, perhaps, some have argued, a rational attempt to show its danger in order to extort more food or fuel aid from an international community. It has kept up arms sales, including those of Scud rockets and other military technology, to the highest bidder, and has undertaken reckless rocket tests. It has also been suggested that North Korea has a sideline in the international drug trade, as recently a ship with North Korean officials carrying massive amounts of drugs was seized on the high seas. In 2002, North Korea also shocked the world with an announcement that it had nuclear weapons. Shortly thereafter, it denied its own announcement that it had nuclear weapons. And in a brief space after that, it once again re-announced that it had nuclear weapons. The question of what's going on in this isolated North Korean state is one of urgent import to the wider world. I want to conclude with a note on the role of confidence in these regimes. The role of confidence in utopian futures, it's difficult to quantify, but clearly is an enormously important ideological and political factor. The kinds of dictatorships we've discussed so far need compelling visions of the future, which is said to be inevitable and unstoppable, to both sustain their own inner momentum and to compel awe from believers as well as their foes, to convince them that resistance is not possible. These are visions of the future that have been propagated with greater or lesser success on the parts of the regimes that we've discussed in today's lecture. In the absence of such confidence in the future vision, with the erosion of that utopian horizon, such regimes can easily stall out and begin to disintegrate. And that's precisely the phenomenon that we'll be discussing in our next lecture on the democratic revolutions of 1989, which could either yield democratic stability or even greater turmoil, as we'll see next time.